First of all, being a niche museum, what stories do you try to tell and to which audience?
Absolutely, and thank you so much for having me, Lu Xing. I'm a big fan of your program.
Thank you.
The Museum of Chinese in America, lovingly called MoCA, is really an extraordinary, nationally recognized museum headquartered in New York City. And the story of the Museum of Chinese in America is really comes in four waves. And the waves of Chinese immigration to America, but not only Chinese immigration, but what we see in the last 40 years since China has opened up is really this back and forth between US and China and the Chinese diaspora. So what the museum tries to do, and I believe it does it well, is curate those stories so that those stories can be known to others. And also that, unfortunately, there are aspects of history that haven't been shared, that aren't well known, that are not in history books. And really that museum supplements the education of those trying to understand the history of what made the United States what it is today.
Now, this year's theme of the International Museum Day is Museums and Contested Histories, Say the Unspeakable in Museums. What do you think of this theme and its significance? And is your museum holding any special activities to mark that day?
The Museum International Day is such an incredible global day for all, for the global community to really think about and reflect and go into a space. What I like to think about as for museums is museums are safe spaces, places where one can really reflect. And the way museums are typically curated is that we can have that space, it's not too cluttered, to really think about the context. This year, Contested Histories is so very relevant across the board, and it actually provides me as the president some solace, some comfort, because the history at the Museum of Chinese in America is quite unknown. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 still needs to make its way into all history books. That is the only legislation in the United States history against a group of people. And when I go into a classroom, when I go into a large auditorium of individuals sharing about the museum, I would say 95% of the people in the room do not know about this very unfortunate legislation that occurred in 1882.
Well, museums are often considered places where we store and present our memories of the past in a creative way. Should museums have a political agenda or a political viewpoint?
Our museum, we consider it a dialogic museum. And what we mean by that, or what I often say to visitors, is that as you go through the museum and understand what we've presented as far as a history of immigration to this country from the Chinese global population, if by the end of that visit you don't have questions for yourself, you don't have questions about your own identity, if you don't question how history is recorded, I think then in some ways the museum has failed. Fortunately, most people do feel those questions surface as they walk through the exhibit. Should museums be political? I think many museums do provide statements, but I think a well-curated museum and well-curated exhibits really allow the audience and the visitor to create their own decisions and opinions on the content that should be rather factual.
Well, whilst going through your CV, one point that really attracted my attention as well is your background. You are a Yale School of Management graduate and you also worked as a Goldman Sachs investment banker. Why did you want to quit those jobs and come back to be a curator of a museum?
All due respect, I manage the curatorial team, but I am the president, which is, I don't get to do all the fun things that the curators get to do on a daily basis. But why MoCA? I guess the question really is not why did I go to a museum, but why did I go to MoCA? And I think as someone who's always looked at the US-China relationship, I'm deeply invested in helping the Chinese global community be understood better by those, their neighbors, by peers. Right now, there are 3.5 million Chinese in America, but as we all know, there are 400,000 Chinese students studying in this country. If things like the Chinese Exclusion Act aren't documented or not well known, then I feel that Chinese living in America and also in the global community haven't really done a very good job. We need more faces of our kind in arts and culture, in politics for that matter, in many different fields. And I think I received so many good skills at Goldman and at Yale School of Management, and I'm just trying to use those transferable skills to manage an institution that really has a wonderful mission and purpose.
Finally, a very short question. As a curator of this museum, what would be your biggest wish?
Oh, right now the museum is wonderfully designed by Maya Lin, the renowned architect and artist. It's about 18,000 square feet. I think the museum really should have at least 50,000 square feet. We have so many stories to tell, and I would like 500,000 visitors minimum a year. So we have a big job to do, but we hope that many will come out and support us.
Nancy Yao Maasbach, President of the Museum of Chinese in America. Thank you very much for joining us. And for more discussion about this topic, I'm very honored to be joined in the studio by Mr. Peter Keller, Director General of the International Council of Museums. Mr. Keller, thank you very much for joining us. Now, first of all, a quiz. How many museums do we have in this world? Do we have the statistics?
No, there is no statistic. Nobody knows how many museums there are. ICOM has 37,000 members. This is what I can say in about 140 countries, but there is no statistics.
And you're here in Beijing for the first time, you told me a while ago. Did you visit any museums this time? What is your impression?
I saw 3 museums, the biggest ones, the National Museum, the Palace Museum, the Capitol Museum. Mm-hmm. And my impression is I was in China 7 years ago in Shanghai. Museums have developed very much in China, very fast.
Yeah. What was that one piece of artifact that stayed in your mind from this time in Beijing?
Oh, I couldn't say. You know.
There are just so many.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, let's come to the main theme. This year's theme, International Museum Day, Museums and Contested Histories, saying the unspeakable in museum. Why this theme? How was this selected?
Well, the topic was suggested by a member to the Assembly, and the Assembly voted for it. It was a democratic process. I think the idea behind it was a German colleague. He knows very well the Holocaust museums in Germany, the concentration camps, and I think he came from this background. But in every continent, in every country, the topic is seen a different way, I think, because...
Yeah, so since you have announced this theme, what has been the feedback?
The feedback is very positive. We are very surprised because we thought it's a very difficult topic, not easy to deal with, because it's unspeakable things you don't want to talk about, you don't want to touch on. And in fact, we've got a very positive feedback, very many activities all around the world. Mm-hmm. And I think this must have something to do with the fact that everybody is touched by this topic.
Yeah, and also maybe there are just so many controversies concerning how we look at our history.
Our history and the history of the others, of course.
Yes, but why? What do you think you are sending this message to, and why do you want to send it now? Is it because the museums in the world have got it wrong so far, and you want to change their focus?
Not necessarily. No, I think we want to show that museums are an open forum where you can deal with this topic. As my colleague from New York said, it's a space where you can go to, where you can think about these things, reflect, and maybe go out with different ideas, having thought about yourself and having thought about this topic.
Well, I noticed the details here. You're calling it museums and contested history, so there is not just one history.
No, there are very different narratives of history, let's say. So this was one of the ideas, to bring these narratives together, and I think this is the museum is the right place for this, because visitors can go there and tell their own histories or see other people's histories.
Mm-hmm. Why the unspeakable here? What do you mean by unspeakable?
Well, we had a long discussion about this title. I'm not sure if I'm not an English native speaker, if it's really good.
Is it
English,
that?
but the idea was that you have a topic you don't want to speak about, you don't want to touch on. It's not that you don't have maybe the words, but it's more an emotional effect, that you step back and don't want to deal with it.
Mm-hmm. And how do you think that museums can present the history in an objective and true manner. As we heard just now, this museum in the United States, they're trying to correct the misconceptions about the Chinese people in America.
I think the important point is that you show the history in its different aspects, the histories, as we said, so that there is not only one narrative, but that there are different groups in, for example, the American population, which have their different histories and which are told in the museum.
Well, I would also like to mention this museum that was just in the news the other day, where the incumbent president of Czech Republic visited in Nanjing. That's called the Memorial Hall of Nanjing Massacre, which marks the Nanjing Massacre, which took place between the end of 1937 and the beginning of 1938. And that museum marks 300,000 victims of that massacre. However, some right-wing activists in Japan are either denying that piece of history or saying the number is actually not so big. What do you think of the role of a museum in trying to present the true picture of that period of history?
Well, I think in this case it was really important, because in this case it's not an unspeakable history you tell, because you're telling only to one public, to a Chinese public, and it would be important to talk to the Japanese public as well. I think this dialogue is the important part in it, that you try to, I think maybe you won't reach the same vision of it. You won't be unanimous in the end, but it would be important to dialogue about it.
Mm-hmm. And also there is this memorial in Japan housed by the Yasukuni Shrine, which is called Yunshinkwan, and there they have some revisionist views about Japan's narrative of that history. And again, so we're seeing really the contested history of both sides.
I think each country, or many countries, have this kind of museum or story. The Koreans have their story, the Latin American countries have their story of torture and military governance. In Germany you have the concentration camps. I think this is maybe why the topic was so well accepted, because it's everywhere you have.
What should the visitor do then? Because when they go to Japan, they see the Japanese side of the narrative, and possibly they make it so powerful and effective that people start to believe in them. And then when they come to China, you see a totally different picture. How are they supposed to really decide for themselves what is the true picture of what happened?
Well, I think this would be the ideal situation, that the visitor sees both museums, and then he's got perhaps his own idea, because he's seen both parts, both parties.
Mm-hmm. But shouldn't it be the objective of a museum to really present the true picture as close as what it can be?
Of course, but I think the important point is not only the objective story, but it's the visitor. That the visitor is, you reach the visitor by telling the story, and that the visitor can think about it, reflect about it, and then make his mind up.
Is it okay for museums to be so politicized, or are we really talking about politicalization of museums?
It's not politicized. And according to the ICOM's definition, a museum is open to the public and in service of society. So this is the basis of a museum, so to say, in our understanding.
Yeah. Another important thing that we have to talk about is how to make museums, or history museums especially, more relevant, more attractive to the younger generation. What are some of the things that can be done in that regard?
Well, some of our committees will work on this in autumn. I don't know yet the outcomes, but I think there are many ways to present stories, or by telling the story, or by presenting it live by tour guides, or in using media, that you can reach a public, even a younger public.